let's say we've got a very simple situation and I want just some input boxes. And maybe I'm just trying to do this with like the size of a rectangle. So I've got one input box for the width and another input box for the height, right? I need to definitely have labels to go with these. So maybe width and height. And just briefly mentioning, the way I got these to be under is by changing from here to that mode. So it looks the same way it does on Android. Right, so, you know, that's a very common sort of thing to have is laying things from top to bottom, right? Especially when you're talking portrait and you're talking phones. It's kind of the same thing we did with web development, right? So this is a really common layout that you're going to see, right? And it works fine as long as you're, you know, that sort of layout feels laid out. I think that's where everybody started with the mortgage calculator. That's fine as long as that's all you want, right? Once I go to maybe a tablet size thing, which would be much larger, that doesn't work as well, right? I'm wasting a lot of space if I'm stretching those all the way to the edge, right, on a larger device. Similarly with the landscape layout, that may not be the most efficient use of space. So you pull this over here, switch this to a landscape, 700 by 400. I think I may have to zoom out here a little bit. So if I have something more like that, well, that same layout may not make a lot of sense, right? Because if I take that over here, then I'm looking at this. And not that it doesn't work, it's just not very efficient. Does that make sense? So how can we better use the space?
On landscape or on landscape and portrait?
Let's just talk about landscape,
okay,
right? Because this is okay. There's not really anything wrong here. But if I take that setting exactly out and take it to another form factor, there is a problem, right? This isn't efficient. So what do I need to do? Well, I've got more space horizontal, right? So some things need to be horizontal, right? And this is where it breaks down if you've chosen to use a linear layout, right? Because if I've gone ahead and kind of set it up and started with the view that I'm going to need a constraint layout at some point, it might be, you're probably going to have easier time when you go over here, okay? So when I go over here, well, maybe we do something easy and we bring those down. And we just say, oh, well, I'll just make these fit next to each other. And in fact, if I've measured kind of the longest width that I need, I might even find that usually the numbers I enter are maybe pretty short, right? So I could even go down to something like that. If I'm thinking about what might work better for landscape, right? That can't fit into a linear layout. You see that?
Yeah, I can't.
That can't. It's not one axis. It's not straight up and down. It's not straight left and right. I could try to rearrange things a little bit and make things this way. I could say, hey, let's just put the labels to the left. You know, that's another alternative, and that does fit into a linear layout. But I would still want to do that as a constraint. Yeah. Okay. So even in cases like this where linear layout might seem easier, I really, really want you to use a constraint layout just because it gets you more practice with it, right? Plus extending it and preparing for it. Cool. So this is definitely more work. Like this is hands down more work to do with constraint. That obviously you have to do with constraint. Does that make sense? Kind of following up there? Okay. So you saw that there's two different variations that you can do over on the landscape layout. You know, whether you're putting labels next to the fields or the fields under the labels. Both of those are options. It really just depends on how much space you're working with, right? The other question is let's say I do want to use a little bit more space. Another alternative that I tend to use quite a bit is I might say, well, let's stretch this up to half the space. That's another option, right? So from the landscape layout, there's at least 3 different ways to do it. It really depends on how you want to use the space. Does that make sense? Like if I'm trying to enter a first and last name, it might make more sense to have a lot more space there, right? Because those things can get longer. Or I'm doing an email password, I might do it like this, right? But I wouldn't want to do it the other way around, where like the labels are next to each other with email password because they're just not enough space. Okay, so let's say I take this approach. I'll take one of those approaches, and we can kind of play around with it. So I need to make a new project. But it is definitely one of those things that constraint layout takes some time to wrap your head around. Like, absolutely. Because it's different than things you've done before. But it's really important that you do because it's the main layout that we're using for Android development. So I'm going to create this as empty activity. I'm going to put this under my new repository here. And let's call this maybe layout example. Oh, and I think I put it into the wrong folder. I definitely did. So close project and clean up what I just did. So I need to go back to my repository. And revert that. Okay, let me try that again. New project. Layout. Go into here. Oop. Another thing I need to remember is to put the name of the project in there. Layout example. Cool. So copy file, export current. And go to here, load mockup file, documents, So if I'm going for that first layout, delete this text view here, and let me just look at it from a blueprint perspective. So from a portrait layout perspective, the first thing I always do is just drag the controls in. So I'm going to drag in a text view, maybe I'll do a number decimal, another text view, and a number decimal. Right, so I've got those 4 fields. I generally find it easiest to just kind of start arranging them roughly where I want, and then really the next thing I would do before you really do anything else, I would immediately at this point recommend going and setting the IDs. They're a really important thing to do, and they're a really important thing to do early. So this is when you should do it. So here we say, hey, we've got the width field. So this is the width label. This is the width input. This is the height label. And this is the height input. Okay. So, I mean, from this perspective, right, I think usually the question I think about when I'm building these is where to start, right? One of the actually the hardest parts of constraint layout is to figure out where to start. Which control do you anchor first, right? Most of the time, the answer is pretty simple. It's the top left corner, usually. It's not always the case. Sometimes I have to jump around depending on what I want to do. The other thing that commonly ends up being is start on the edges and then work your way in. That's another thing that happens a lot, right? But here I can take the approach that it's the top left corner and work my way down. So set it to 8 dp default margin and just start constraining. And I've got a layout. Okay. Now, that for some applications is sufficient, right? Sometimes that may be all you need, is to anchor it to the top left corner like that. The problem with stopping here is that it just doesn't utilize the space well, right? It means that if I'm looking at this on a tablet, which let me go ahead and run this on a tablet, it means that you're going to be wasting most of the screen real estate, right? Maybe if you have other things on that screen, you can utilize it for other things, but it's just not going to make very good use of the space, right? This is not the kind of application that I want to use or I want to see. Does that make sense? So the next question is how do we occupy the rest of that space, right? How do we make it take up more of that available space? Now, on the tablet, I mean, the answer for the tablet is we could actually put these side by side, right? But what I'm going for right now first is the phone layout, right? So on the tablet, really not very good. It's only taking up a tiny shred of the available space. But let me try it on the phone and see what we've got there. So it's possible on the phone it may not be as noticeable just because the screen is smaller to start with, right? So we are losing and wasting some space on the right, but may not be as clear, right? I think a lot of people look at this and just go, oh, it's fine, right? But I look at that and I say, oh, there's a problem, right? Because you're not really adjusting to the size of the screen, right? This is always going to be so wide. Cool. Does that help answer part of the question? Right. So part of the question is now that we've got this, we want to shove it over and have it extend to the side of the screen, right? Some ways that you can do that. A lot of times students will start with maybe taking this approach. Maybe I take all those four, I give them a width, basically stretching them out, and maybe I say, hey, they're all 500 dp wide. What's the problem?
It's a fixed amount.
It's a fixed amount, right? So on some screens, it's going to be not enough, right? On the tablet, they'll be too short. They'll be not wide enough. But on the phone, they're maybe too small, right? So we don't really want to use fixed dimensions wherever we can avoid them, because we always run into problems where it's too small or too big. Does that make sense? So what we're trying to do is get to a point where we can have it be dynamic, have it be responsive, right? Is the common word that we learned in first semester, right? So let me go back to the content, right? So what was the thing I told you to do to fix that? How do we go about solving this so that it's stretched out? Right, so put constraints on the right side. That's why we're adding constraints to the right side. It's because otherwise it's not really relative. It doesn't size to the side of the screen. That's what we're going about. So I want to do this. I want to do that. Oops. I got to be careful about dragging there because I don't want to create a margin of 80. And so we got the idea, we've got the springs on both sides, right? It's also worth just taking a look at what it looks like here now, right? If I say, let's look at that look at it as is right now, that's actually a fine layout, right? It's a lot nicer because the unused space is balanced, right? That's a big difference. Like, if you're having unused space and it's unbalanced, that's where it looks really ugly. If it's at least balanced, it's not as big of an issue. Does that make sense? So at least if we're going to do this, we might want to balance that space. Okay. Now, I might want to be more specific with how much space it takes up. So if I am centering it like this, I do typically want to go through these and give them some sort of width. So if I know the screen, let me go down to the generic 4-inch. So I'm looking at this on an XSS. I could go in here and say, hey, these are all, say, that's a little bit too big, maybe 250. Make them all 250 tall. That means on whatever device there is, there's going to be a little bit of leftover space on the leftover. That's a perfectly fine solution. That's a perfectly fine design, right? If you're saying, hey, let's take a fixed width, that they're all consistent here, and it's consistently balanced left and right, that looks great. It's where you get unbalanced is where you have to kind of, it looks very amateurish, if that makes sense. It looks very unprofessional. So that's where we want to at least make sure that we're balancing the space. Okay? Yeah.
So on smaller devices, is it ideal to center your labeling, or is it okay to kind of have them to the left? Like, I feel like I'm just kind of used to seeing some forms having like the label to the left side.
The answer is that's entirely subjective, right? That's entirely subjective. You can left align everything or you can center align everything. Both of those are acceptable. Both of those are done on Android all the time. Both centering and left aligned are really common.
The Nexus S that's the smallest one on the Android studio, so that's why you're looking at
Yeah, that's why I'm testing it there on the Nexus S, because then I know if I go back, it'll work here, and if I go back to, say, one of the Pixel devices, that's bigger. So it's definitely going to fit there, and it's going to fit on anything larger. So because my Nexus S is that smallest one, that's where I want to test things if I do have to test things with like fixed dimensions and such. Cool. So like this is perfectly valid as a solution, right? This is perfectly valid as a way to implement that UI. And whether those labels are left aligned, whether they're centered, that's all fine, right? But I do want to see alignment, whether it's on the left or the center, or in some cases the right. There are also cases where you might right align things, and that's okay too. It's a little bit less common. In fact, usually when you see right alignment, it's not everything right aligned. It's usually some things are right aligned and some things are left aligned. So you might see something where maybe I have width here, and this one's right aligned. So that one's left aligned and this one's right aligned. That's a perfectly fine way, right? So there's more than one way to solve this, if that makes sense. So now, the way that I had suggested that usually I end up going about this, I usually set these to 0 dp. That stretches it all the way to the edge. You might notice that now it's going all there because it lost my margins. I need to reintroduce them. So 8 and 8. Unfortunately, when you put a constraint on both the left and the right side of the activity of your layout, it does go ahead and set those left and right margins down to 0. Has been a thing I've definitely noticed in recent years. I wish it didn't do that, but that's been the case for a while. So the benefit of stretching it all the way like this, setting to 0 dp rather than fixed size, is it scales to a broader range. You're not getting that leftover space, but it is going to look good on a wider range of fonts, generally speaking. I don't have to necessarily fine tune the width. Cool. But either of those are fine, right? Where I set it to 250 is fine, setting it to 0 is fine. Either of those you can make work. Cool. And so I haven't specified that in your instructions, right? Because those are all choices that you can make, right? Those are all design choices that you can make. I said here's the inputs that you need to have, but you figure out how to lay them out. Okay. But does that make sense in terms of that constraint layout? Yes. Is it more work than setting up a linear layout? Absolutely. Absolutely.
I made the mistake initially of anchoring the top one,
Yeah.
The topmost control to the left and right, like you've done there, but then the ones following it to their nearest sibling's edge instead of the parent's edge.
Right.
What's the effect of that?
That's a really good question. Yeah. So should you anchor it to the sibling or should you anchor it to the parent? Okay, so let's say I tweak this a little bit and I come up with a different variation. So I'm going to change back to all of these having a width of 250 dp. Okay, so let's say here I anchor the left side of this to the left side of that, and left side of that to the left side of that. Okay. Now, first of all, you might notice that things went a little bit off. And basically that is because one of these sides has margin and the other one doesn't. So this one has, for whatever reason, their logic put 0 in here on the left and 8 on the right, so it's being shifted off. So if I'm doing this, I actually usually go back to a default margin of 0 because it works out better. So I do have to play around with that. If I'm going to anchor this underneath like that, I need to have 0 on the left and 0 on the right, and I can kind of keep going through this process. Now that I've set it to 0 as my default, it should behave a little bit better, although it seems to be still creating one side as 8 and the other side as 0. There it goes. Now they're perfectly lined up. Yeah.
So ideally, one with that is just making them all the same size.
Yeah. So that's a good question, right? The point is, first of all, that this is a valid solution, right? This is something you can do, and yes, it does make them all the same size. The benefit of doing something like this, we'll go back up to a different device, is if I set it up right, I can potentially change the one. This one up to, say, 400. Let's see if 400 dp is going to fit. Yeah, so let's say I change that one up to 400. All of the others are going to potentially come along with it. Now, they didn't come along with it. Why? Well, because I previously set them all to 250, right? So I need to go back to make those, I need to make those match constraint. There we go. So now if I change this one, all the others come with it, right? There are cases where you may want that. Most of the times I do that where I want maybe an input and a label to have the same width. So I might constrain the label, both sides of that label, to the size of the input. So the input I choose one way, and then the size of the label is purely determined off of the size of the input. Does that make sense? That happens sometimes. In fact, this is a trick that I definitely use when I'm doing that landscape layout, more so than I use for the portrait layout. But that's a fine solution too. There's nothing wrong with it. It depends on what you're doing. Now, the one caveat is things get a little bit interesting if, say, in this layout, what happens if I want to hide that first label? What happens if that first label goes invisible? So remember that these are all set to 0 dp, right? So they're the height, they're based on, their width is based on the constraint. Okay. So if I go to here and I change the visibility, there's a few visibility options. I can go to, normally they're by default they're visible. There's actually 3 settings for visibility. You can go to invisible, which at that point, when it's invisible, it just is hidden, but it still takes up space. The third option is the one we actually very rarely do. I use invisible for anything. It's usually not what you want. On the other side, there's gone. Okay, so what happened there, when I went from visible to gone, it no longer takes up any space. Well, all the controls beneath it were based on the width of it. Its width is now 0, so therefore their widths are all 0. I wouldn't have that problem if I anchored everything to the parent. Does that make sense? So there are considerations and there are reasons why you might want to do it one way or the other, especially when visibility is something that's going to be dynamic. Cool. Does that help a little bit? There? Other questions? Does that answer the different variations?
I was going to say, like, outside of the thing, like, I like the idea of like doing that linear, like it kind of seems more code driven in my opinion. I do see the importance of like just getting some experience working with that.
Right.
But I find it interesting that the constraint layout apparently has better performance than like any of the other ones.
Yes, yeah. The constraint layout is absolutely the most performance compared to all of them, which actually is weird, especially when you think the linear layout is simple. It's actually more perform and actually outperforms the linear layout, it turns out. And it basically comes down to the place where linear layout becomes expensive. You probably saw in the lab at some point mentioned using weight, right? Remember using weight to stretch the center part out. So you set a weight of 1 and default to 0, so it took up all the weight. Okay, that weight part is what makes linear layout expensive. If you have no weights set, linear layout's fairly cheap. It's still expensive because it still has to go do all of them in order. So it has to go here, how big are you? How big are you? How big are you? How big are you? Has to do that in sequence. It has to always do everybody because, okay, if this one changes size, then the other ones move. Then all of them move. Because every single one, like the last one in the linear layout, is affected, let's say you've got 10 in there, is affected by the 9 things before it, right, where it appears on the screen. That doesn't happen with constraint layout. Your elements are only constrained or only determined by the things that they're constrained to. So if the thing that they're constrained to doesn't move, it doesn't have to redetermine where that thing is, right? So for instance, if you look at this one, that top text view, what is it constrained to? Just the parent, right? So the only thing that's going to affect it is if the parent changes. Okay. What about the one beneath it? Well, that one is affected by, the only thing it's constrained to is the first label, right? The first text view. So if that first text view changes, it changes. If this changes, that changes. This changes, that changes. So it does have to do it in a chain, but it turns out that it's able to also do this a little step at a time. So it can do this per frame. When you're dealing with linear layouts or relative layouts, it has to pause the entire program to do the measuring and do the re-rendering, and then it can show it. It can't show it partially there. Constraint layout actually is able to animate things to the point where they're supposed to be. So what it can do is it can do a little bit of step. It's like, oh, they're being pulled this way, so I'll pull it this way, render a frame, keep going, pull the frame. So it doesn't have to figure out the complete layout before the first render. So it's able to actually amortize the work and do animations as things change. So like you saw, when I made that first one invisible, when it went to gone, it didn't immediately go there, it animated there. Constraint layout's the only one that's able to do that. It's the only one that's able to animate that because of how the constraints work, right? Because it can step the constraints from where they were to where they are now. Cool. If you know anything about game development, it's actually very similar to what we do with game physics. It's basically, constraint layout is basically a physics engine, where these constraints, these springs, are basically exerting a force on the thing that they're connected to. That's actually what's happening, is that this text view is being pulled to the left and pulled to the right, and so we just animate that. We just do the physics calculation with that. So it's really based on a physics, which is part of why it's very different, right? Because this is not your traditional way of thinking about, like, hey, then you're gonna just put things in the order I want them to. It's like, no, there's these forces, use these forces to lay things out. Cool.
So what about laying things out horizontally in constraint layout?
Yes, so horizontally. As you've already seen, there are at least 3 different ways to do this, 3 or 4 different ways to do this in the portrait perspective. In the landscape, the horizontal perspective, there's even more, is what I've always found. I've always found that there are a bunch of more ways to do it in the horizontal orientation than there are in the portrait orientation. And I usually end up having to use more tricks here than maybe I would do in portrait. Cool? Okay. So remember what we did. So first thing I'm going to do is crank the landscape variation and remove all the constraints. Okay. Remember what the first thing that I did? I kind of dragged the elements in. I position them. So that's where I'm going to start here. Is I'm going to position them where I want them. So let's say I do something like, roughly speaking, I want to go there. And it looks like it added some constraints, so let me remove those back off. Right? So I'm trying to get something like this. Okay. As I said, this is one where it tends to require a few more tricks to figure it out. A few more tricks to get there. Okay. So where did I start first when I did the portrait one? I started from the top right corner. Okay. Can I start from the top right corner here? Can I? Probably.
I think you could, right?
Okay, so let's try it. So let me anchor it to the top right corner. This is always one of those areas where, oh, I need to go back to 8 and fix all those. And so anchor, anchor, anchor. So that's the dirt simplest version, right? Is anchor everything up and to the left. Direction of these are very important. So it's important that all of these 4 elements only have 2 constraints on them. Okay, so they're always going left. There are no elements here that are constrained to the right. So, first problem. It looks like it's working on the designer. It's not working on my device. Why is that? Note this is the Nexus S. Nexus S is smaller, right? Okay, so that's one thing I didn't account for. Okay, so I can at least go to the designer and look here. Okay.
Oh, you got the 400 width still set, don't you?
I probably do. Actually, yeah, they're all set to 300. So maybe what I want to do is select them all and set their width to wrap content. Which is step 1, right? Is, okay, they probably shouldn't all have a fixed width. Let's try them with wrap content and try to run that. That's not anywhere near usable, right? Because my labels are all over on the left, right? So the naive solution of anchor it all to the top left isn't usable at all. It's not even an option because this is what you get. Okay. Now, I could rewind a second and say, oh, it was close to there with the fixed width. Maybe I can fine tune it and give them all a width of 200 dp, right? And then it will work on the Nexus S. But what did I say is one of the things you're watching for? You're watching for balanced space, right? The space is not balanced. You're stuck strictly to the upper left corner. It's not going to scale well to the different form factors. Okay. So, what do I do?
Isn't there like a chain tool or something like that?
There is a chain tool, right?
And a chain to like the left and right side.
Okay. So how do I, which is a good thing to propose, how do I initiate that chain? How do I create that chain? Do you remember?
So you select the items you want to pull together.
Okay. So which items do I want to select? Do I want to set a column? Do I want to select a row? Okay. So and here's the interesting insight. Start with the inputs, not the labels. Okay. Start with the inputs and not the labels. So this is one where you absolutely really can't work from the top left corner down because it doesn't work. So we actually start with the inputs first and turn those into a chain. Do you remember how I get that to a chain?
It's one of the buttons in the top toolbar at the bottom row. One of those three buttons to the right of the infer constraints magic one.
I'm talking about one of these.
Either the pack or the align. It's not the guidelines.
So it's none of these.
Oh, it's none of those?
It's none of those. Short answer, don't use those buttons largely.
Okay. Oh yeah, that's right. You said not use pack.
Yeah. So you've got some alignment buttons and some pack buttons, but that's actually not how we create the chain. Right click. Yeah. It's in the right click. So I think at some point it actually used to be in the toolbar, but it's not there anymore. So it's the only way to get to it I know is from the right click toolbar. So it's under chains, and I'm going to create a horizontal chain. There. So step one is to take a row, and specifically we want to take the inputs and turn those into a chain. Because what we want to do is we really want the inputs to determine the size of things rather than the labels to determine the size of things. And if I start the other way around, if I start by turning the labels into a chain, you're generally going to lead into where, oh, well, now your size of your input is based on the size of the label, which shouldn't be the case. The size of the label should be based on the size of the input.
So like, pick whatever object larger, or like the larger object, is that kind of what?
That's a good rule of thumb. The problem is the whole reason why we need to pick the input is because which one's larger changes. So let's say, and in translations is the big part where this happens. I say I go turn this into Spanish. My labels are going to get longer, and more often in Spanish, the label is longer than the input. More often than not in Spanish and other languages, the language is longer, the label is longer than the input. And therefore, the best thing to do is to wrap the label. And if you're going to wrap the label, well, you can't use the size of the label to determine the size of the input. You need the input to determine the size of the label.
What do you mean by wrap the label?
To wrap the text on the 2 lines.
Oh, wrap. Okay.
Yeah. German sometimes the same thing. So you say, hey, here's like 2 words, and then wrap the other like 2 words. And now you got 2 lines worth of label. But that only happens, again, if the inputs determine the size of the label. Okay. Now, I could go through here, and I could also maybe take these 2. I'm going to undo this in a second, but I can show you one way that you can set this up. Let's say I do 2 chains. So I have one horizontal chain of labels, and I have another horizontal chain of inputs. Okay. It's worth mentioning right now, I have all of these set to a fixed width of 200, which is part of why it's showing up the way that it is, right? Let's try this. Okay, is this a reasonable layout? Yeah, that's fine. That's a reasonable way to solve it. Because what I said, you know, the more important part I'm looking for is that you're balancing the white space. The white space here is balanced. That's fine. Cool?
So I'm just wondering, when is it ideal to use like the baseline thing, like as opposed to like constraints or like?
So 90% of the time the answer is don't use baseline. Okay. The one time where I use baseline is if I have a layout that looks like this. Here's an input, and the label is to the left of that input. Then use baseline. Then you say the baseline, the label is aligned to the baseline of the input, and specifically that direction, not the other way around. This is aligned to the baseline of the input. Because again, you want your input, your label to be based on your input, not the other way around, because translations. Cool. That's, if it's to the left of the label, that's basically the only time I use it. Because then those two things, that's where you want them to line up where the text lines up. Any other case, it's not something you want. Cool. Yeah.
So you have a fixed width set for those.
Yeah.
Controls.
Yep.
But mine are set for wrap content.
Yep.
For all four, and it looks strange.
Okay.
Really
So let
strange.
me choose all of them. Not match constraint. Wrap content.
Yep, that's what I got.
Yep.
How does it know how much? Oh, is it? Oh, it's distributing all that space equally between the two items.
So just to clarify, so everybody's on the same page, why does it look weird? Well, it looks weird because the label is not centered with the input here. It's a little bit to the right of center, and here it's a little bit to the left of center. Right? It's not centered with the input that it should go with. And you're right. You're asking. You're saying the right thing. So when it distributes the space on this row, it's saying, okay, this text view takes up this much space. This text view takes up this much space, and then I'll figure out what space is left over and put it evenly here, here, and here, dividing that space into 3 chunks. It's doing the same thing in this chain, where it's dividing the space between here, here, and here, but it's not able to consider that this chain is connected to the other chain. Does that make sense? The chains are not connected to each other. It's not able, they're being calculated independently. So they make sense by themselves, but they don't make sense together. Okay. So what I do is I'm going to select the top. I'm going to select the top 2, and I'm going to get rid of their constraints. And actually, I'm going to also get rid of the constraint here and here. Okay, so there's no vertical constraints anymore, because I'm going to come back and fix those in a second. So what I want is, remember, I mainly want the input to drive the position of the label. Okay? So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to say, let's take a link here, constrain the left. Actually, let me make sure this is set to 0. 0. Constrain the left of the label to the left of the input, right of the label to the right of the input. Left of the label here, right of the label here. So rather than the top row being in a chain, each of the labels are moving relative to wherever the input is. And that means that this works even if I have interesting scenarios like, well, what if these things don't need to be the same width? What if this one is 100 dp and this one is 200 dp? The labels are still centered on the inputs that they go with. Because again, the input's driving the position of the label. Does that make sense? That's a trick that we use all the time. Now, caveat here, I don't do it this way specifically, because what breaks in this scenario is if the label's too long, and go select this table, and make this long enough, and maybe keep going. If the label's too long, it starts going out and getting into the space that might be reserved for other inputs. Because what's the width of it? The width of it is wrap content. So it's as wide as the content, right? As long as it's wrap content, it's very unlikely that it will wrap, counter to the name. If you set the width to wrap content, it probably will not wrap. The only time it will wrap, if it's set to wrap content, is if it hits the edges of the parent, which is usually way too long, way too late, okay? So to actually get it to wrap, I don't need it on wrap content, I need it on match constraint. So if I go here, match constraint, now I've told it to be based on the constraints, which means, okay, it can be up to as wide as the input, and from there it'll start wrapping down. Let me move these a little bit. Now, you might notice, okay, yes, it started wrapping. Let me maybe make it a little bit shorter. Let me, there, forwards. It's wrapped, but it started to kind of wrap into the input beneath it. Do you see that? Which I want it to do. Okay. So, but that's not necessarily real at this point because I don't actually have any vertical constraints, right? If I were to run this right now, all of this stuff would be, all four of these would go up to the top of the view because, top of the screen, because nothing's anchored vertically. Okay. So here's another case where the direction of your constraint matters, right? Should the vertical position of the label be based on the vertical position of the input, or should the vertical position of the input be based on the vertical position of the label? And which constraint should it go? Vertically, should this be constrained the top of this to the bottom of this, or the bottom of this to the top of that?
We know that the input line is going to be the same height all the time, right?
I don't know that.
We don't know that?
Don't necessarily know
So
that.
it could be two.
Maybe it should. Maybe it should, but I don't know that at this point. That's one possibility. I can make that decision or I can not make that decision, and that will give me two different layouts. If I say that the height of the input is fixed, I'll get one layout. If I say the height isn't fixed, I'll get a different layout. Well, one thing I definitely want to do is I want to make sure that the label doesn't overlap the input, right? The best way to ensure that that doesn't happen is to say, maybe anchor it, I think take this, anchor this down here to the bottom. Boop. And why is that? Oh, it's fitting on that view. It's not fitting in the blueprint view. That's why. So now it's fitting on top, right? So if I just say, hey, let's stick it to the top of the input, that's one way to get there. So in this case, because I'm going down, in the end, I'm going to end up with a layout where all of the inputs are at the same height, but the labels are in different positions, right? So this label you can see goes out a little bit. This label is at a different height for the top. Cool. Now I still need to constrain things, right? So the vertical position of the label is constrained, but this is not. So I need to constrain these two to the top, and then I'm just going to have to figure out what number this should be. So that's one that works. My inputs are anchored to the parent, and then my labels are anchored to the input. Does that make sense for everybody? See what's going on there? That has a good tolerance in terms of making the label wrap and allowing for long labels. But if the other thing is the thing I want, maybe rather than constraining, the other way I could do this is I could constrain those, constrain the labels to the top, and then don't constrain here, don't constrain here. If I say the labels are the ones that are consistent at a consistent height, you can see what happens with the inputs. The inputs are not at a consistent height. Is there any way I can fix that? Well, one thing to pay attention to, the reason why it's breaking is because the label is longer, right? If both of these labels are short, you can't tell. Do you see that? As long as the labels are short, this is fine. And that's where sometimes you have to test things and go into, say, Spanish to see it break, right? Because the length of label is different. So let's say going back to here, we do have a label that's longer and is causing a word wrap here. What do? What's causing the inputs to be misaligned?
So you would have to anchor the height of the input, either one to the one next to it.
What do you mean the one next to it?
I'm not sure how that even works.
Huh? the bottom of these two together? Let's try. So you're saying anchor this to the bottom of that?
What did that just do?
Well, there's an 8th margin. But notice that there's a right now there's a constraint on the top and the bottom, so it's being stretched both up and down. So it's not working because I have the constraint on the top. That's actually okay.
But what if during translation it turns out the right side has the overlapping text, or the wrapping text? So you don't
It's a
know
good question. It's a good question. So you know, let me grab this. So even with the same text, right, it's not wrapping, because one of the things I did previously is I made these two different widths, right? This one's shorter, that one's wider, so this one actually wraps later. Okay, so I still need to add more text in there to get the same effect. I think one of the big takeaways as we're doing this is to understand that there's never just like one right answer. There's never just like, okay, well, this is always going to work for this. It's like, hey, I've got 4 different ways to do it in my toolbox, and I just use the one that works for whatever I'm doing. So let me make this to match constraint. There we go. Okay. So as long as, they're the same height, see there we're wrapping 2 lines, that's okay. But if I make this one shorter, there we go. Yeah. So now I've got a problem that, yeah, this is overlapping because that one's taller. And this is kind of presuming that one is taller than the other. What's up?
Strange. Can you run yours real quick just to see how it looks? I think I've got the same as you. Mine looks normal.
Well, the inputs look like they're in the same place.
Mm-hmm. And even with your cursor on one, and start typing, the numbers don't get overlapped. And design the blueprint nice enough.
So it looks fine in the design view. It's looking different in the blueprint view.
About more text.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, there it is. All text breaks it.
There. It just has to be a lot more text to get to that point. Okay. Back to the blueprint view. Okay. Well, I could flip it around, right? So what we did, we said, let's constrain the bottom of, let's constrain it the other way around. So let's say this is constrained to the top here, and this one's constrained to the bottom there. Similar approach. I could flip it around, right? So if you know which one's going to be longer, you can just use a different layout. You rarely ever know which one's going to be longer. But if you know which one is, then you can do that. Now, there are cases where you might know where that's longer because maybe you have something where one of them is some actual text. You might say this is the, maybe I have subtotal is one of the labels and the other label is a $sign. Well, like I know the $sign is going to be short and I know subtotal is going to be a longer word. So I might be able to make some intuitive guesses there, but generally not. You generally can't say, okay, well this thing's shorter in English than this other thing. Usually if you go in another language, it's backwards, where the longer thing is the shorter thing and vice versa. So let me remove the bottom constraint here and move this back up. Okay, so this is where I started, right? Well, the main problem that occurred was that the labels are two different heights. Can I force the two labels to have the same height? The answer is yes. Right? So if I take one approach, I can say, well, let's just fix their height rather than wrap content. Let's fix them to maybe 50 dp. They're both a height of 50 dp, and it lines up nicely. And that's one approach I could take, right? It means that I have to figure out that number, but I can take that approach, right? It means that I have a fixed height that I have to figure out, but is a possible thing. In fact, one of the things I can do in Android is if I make this that number here, I can make it basically a resource, a reference, and then I can just, change it from language to language to language. It is possible to actually have a number like this that, say, is a different value for Spanish. So this is actually a valid solution because I can fine-tune that number per language. But it means I have to fine-tune it per language, right? It means I have to test every language that I'm working with and get it to work based on the text that's there. Okay? So that's one approach. One approach is to just say, hey, we've got a 50 dp, and I'm going to tune that to be the height. I think if I look at the design view, I think part of my text may be getting cut off because I've chosen a value that's, I think, too small. Yeah, if I choose a value that's too small, it gets cut off and can be harder to tell, but it's an approach that can be taken. Another thing I can do is I can kind of take a trick from what we've already done. You remember how you can see how I've said the width of these labels is based on the width of the inputs. I could make the height of them based on the height of something else. So I could say, let's go back to these being a height of wrap content, and then take the bottom of the label and hook the bottom of the label to the bottom of that label, and maybe I get something. Now, it's not working exactly because there's a top and bottom, so it's halfway in the middle. Now, one thing I might mention, because I don't think I've mentioned it yet, has anybody tried to play with the bias yet?
I keep finding it when
Okay. So the bias is an interesting slider. It's right over here. See this slider here? That's the horizontal bias. This is the vertical bias. It's a percentage. Okay. So it's a percentage of where is it. It only pops up where it is between two different things it's constrained to. It only pops up if you have constraints on both sides. So if I have a top constraint and a bottom constraint, I get a vertical bias. The left and the right, then I get a horizontal bias. So what this does is I can actually play around with this and move it up and down a little bit. The one thing to be careful about with the bias is I would not recommend using anything other than 0, 50, or 100. Because percentages are weird and they can very easily look off if you use anything else. So 0% says it's all the way at the beginning, 100% means all the way at the end, 50 is exactly in the middle. So if I want to say, let's make the bias all the way down to the bottom, okay, fine. And I can also do a similar thing over here. Oh, I guess I can't do that because it's constrained the other way. So I can bias that there. Let's see what happens with the horizontal bias. So it should be, oh, there it doesn't actually matter.
We have match constraint, right?
Yeah, because of match constraint. So this one still doesn't matter because it's in the chain. Okay. Yeah. So constraint works sometimes. I think if I do have a fixed size on them. But I don't know that that's why. Yeah, it's still there. I think it's because it's the chain. But that is part of what's happening. Yeah, I think it's because of the chain. I think the chain is ignoring the bias. So you can play around with that, and in this case, that's one way for me to get there is by pushing this down. I think I've got a there. So I could go to a bias of 0 and then line things up. Still, case where you have to know which one is taller. So there are some cases, especially when you're dealing with the landscape layout, where it really turns out that the best way sometimes to align things is to just use some fixed dimensions. I wish there's a way around it, but sometimes that turns out that you just can't, depending on how you set it up. Now, most of the times what I'll do, I had set these up with 100 and 200. Usually what I'll do is I'll set their width to, where did it go? Their width to mass constraints, and then I'll get something like this. Is usually what I would prefer to see when I'm laying these things out. So I usually go down that route. Make the inputs match constraints and then hook the labels to the inputs. Cool.
And then you'd also probably want to maybe adjust the text inside of the what do they call it? Not orientation, but the alignment of the text inside the label.
Yeah.
Closest to the input, right? Something like that.
You said closest to the input.
In the case where you have a tall label, you might want to align the text vertically at the bottom so that it's closest to the label.
Right. Yeah, so you're saying you might want to put this down here. Yeah. So one way you can do that is you can either set the gravity. You can set the gravity to the bottom. If you set the gravity, that'll move the text down. The other way I can do is back to what I had done before with the constraints, is to just kind of reorganize them a little bit. So back to the blueprint view. Let me set these both to remove the constraints on there, and set these to be the width. I'm going to set these both to wrap content in terms of their dimensions. Boop. The other way I would do that is flip it upside down, kind of, and make this one, maybe push this one a good amount of margin down. So those are pushed down, and then anchor it to here. Again, there's a bazillion different ways to get the same effect. Back down. Oh, that height should be wrap content, and that 0. This should be here. This should be here. And that's how I would set it up.
I like that.
It's just, it's hard to wrap your head around because it's backwards. It's the two inputs, first of all, are anchored to the top, and then inputs are strictly anchored to, the labels are anchored to the inputs. And that way I kind of get the gravity by default, but I have constraints that are kind of overlapping each other. Like this is jumping up over to the parent. And I do have to fine tune those numbers. Looks like one of those is off by 2 pixels. Yeah. So I'd usually do something like that. That's what I would usually take.
So that's a lot of
So you can see, there's a lot of different ways, and especially when you go to your landscape layouts and you're looking at, looking at landscape and looking at tablet layouts, the larger layouts, you have a lot more knobs to turn, right? When you're going to vertical, you have horizontal things, is where you have to use a lot more of the constraints. Cool. Okay. Other questions? Did everybody get to the point where you're starting to read the values from the fields and processing them? Okay. Definitely make sure you play around with that part today. Okay. And if there's more questions there, I can answers some, because you're probably going to run into some interesting behavior as soon as you start dealing with how do I do the calculations, how do I get the inputs, how do I parse it, and those kind of things. So, all right, I'm going to pause this here.